Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, I beg your pardon, in partnership with Wits University School of Governance, has launched a book exploring protest culture in the country. That book, which is titled Protest in South Africa, Rejection, Reassertion, Reclamation, looks into the effectiveness of protests in influencing change post-1994. One of the co-editors of that book is Rekgotsofetse Chikane, who joins us now in our studio for more on what I think is a timely book, given what we're dealing with.
Who would have known?
Exactly. Did you plan this? I doubt it. But I mean, I think you could have released this book at any other time and we probably would find a story to connect us to it. But as a start, I mean, is it fair to say that most, if not all, protests we're seeing, at least in contemporary South Africa, have underpinning it some level of dissatisfaction with government, either at municipal, provincial, or national level, or are we just being too harsh on the state?
So I don't think we're being too harsh on the state. The state must do what it needs to do. However, the point of our book was to show that there are obvious reasons that people protest that are in the national consciousness of the country, which is usually related to service delivery and anger with the state. But what we try and do with the book is to say, to look at protests in that way actually only reads half of the story. But there are other more nuanced issues within the country that lead people to want to engage in protest action. What we find out in the book is that we investigate this, or some of the chapters investigate the notion of citizen-to-state protest. In certain instances, we have communities versus community protests in particular, right? In other instances, it's actually not the state itself, but a subsidiary being community vis-a-vis the police-related protests. Right, and what we try and do in this book is to unpack all the different nuanced approaches to protest in the country so that we get a broader understanding of just how bad the country is, right, and the demand by citizens for some sort of democratic life. And that's what we really try and unpack in the book. I think simply saying, you know, only protest against the state is really looking at a really high level and doesn't allow us to get deeper to then understand what is really generating these tensions. And when these tensions are generated, what does it look like in the end?
And what are you finding does do that? I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why people will take to the streets. And as I say this, I'm reminded by another colleague of mine who was reminding us that at some stage there was such widespread dissatisfaction against the former president, Jacob Zuma, that you found, and I'm going to say the profile because it speaks to the point I'm trying to make, white old ladies who typically wouldn't be part of a protest taking to the streets, and that's when that infamous video of them singing next to a traffic light went by.
I like the song.
Exactly. If you can still remember it, right? And that's raised questions around what it is that would drive even that person to the streets. And I suppose the answer is nuanced.
Yeah, it is nuanced. So it's funny that you asked that. So the chapter that myself and Dr. Linge write is around protest apathy in the country. And what we try and do in that chapter is that we try and target who doesn't protest in the country and why don't they protest. It's one thing to say, well, I don't protest because I don't have time. I don't protest because, you know, I'm not willing to put myself at risk. But we wanted to quantify that number and then ask the question, what happens when you finally motivate that person to protest? What type of protest activities do they then engage in when you co-opt someone? So these are the things that we're trying to unpack in the book, right? It's the idea of not just who protests, it's about who doesn't protest, the communities that get affected by protests, the responses by communities to state actions that look good on paper. So one of the papers deals with oil mining and oil exploration around the West Coast. Right? And it's about rural communities there saying, even though this is a developmental project of the state, started back in 2010, 2011, the communities are saying, though this might positively contribute to the economy of the country in the long run, what will also happen in the long run is that you're going to decimate these communities. Right? So we're advocating, and that is rural communities that are both black and white protesting along the West Coast against a developmental program of the state, right? And these are the interesting things and the tensions that we have to deal with. It's the things that we try and unpack in the book.
It's also very interesting to always find out what follows a protest, right? In some instances, it's just barren land because of the nature of that protest, and we'll unpack that in just a moment. But in others, really good things can come out of protests. I'm thinking, for instance, of what took place in Kolobeni, where we know that mining companies were hoping to move in there, and what came out of that was organization from communities that created a much more sustainable, long-lasting entity that continues with that kind of activism. What differentiates how things turn out? Do we even know?
Yeah, so I think I can give two reasons. One is when protest changes the logic of its site of protest. right? So we just saw at Wits University that the university space in the country has been littered with protests over the last 20 years. But the protests need to get to a certain level before the university takes notice of their grievances. What needs to happen is a protest action that works in conjunction with the university to change the logic of the protest site, right? So that you're no longer antagonistic, that you reorganize the relationship. And that's what protest is about. When you're not receiving the services, or if you're not receiving the goods that were promised to you or owed to you in one way or another, how do you then reorganize that relationship where someone is keeping or withholding or oppressing you or some sort of opposition to you? So that's the one way. The other flip side is the co-option of things, of how most protests get settled is that we will talk to the leaders and we'll offer the leaders something. Right. We might not fully guarantee all your wins, but we'll give you leaders a win to show face with your community, with your protesters. And an interesting one is when leaders do that for the benefit of their community. And the other one is when they do it for the benefit of themselves. So going back to the book, there's one chapter that deals with what Professor Mapungubwe talks about, transactional activism. This idea that protest leaders get co-opted by companies that they are protesting against by giving them a job, by giving them a role, whether it's bringing them into government to say, stop protesting and we'll give you a job. Right? And these are the fascinating tensions that you don't see at a high level, but you have to understand them to understand why protests keep generating themselves.
It's tensions that also exist in labor, right?
Yeah.
We see leaders of unions in some instances landing up on the payroll of the bosses that they're going to negotiate with for workers. But let's not digress. Another interesting sort of, I guess, thing to reflect upon as we try and make sense of the nature of protests in this country is why sometimes they turn so violent, right?
Yeah.
And there's two main things that I've been able to think about. The one thing is that, the violence has been role modeled over the years. Of course, we know our history in this country and how things used to turn out, at least before our democratic dispensation, and maybe even recently. The other thing is, some people might argue that people get into violent protests because they know they're going to get away with whatever crimes are committed along the way. I wonder if any of that came up for you.
Yeah, so when we think about violence in protests, there's an interesting term that you use there, and it's turned violent, which presupposes that the protest wasn't violent in the first place. So the assumption that we make is ordinary citizens are engaging in some sort of democratic right to engage with protest activity. And then we say it turned violent. And the question then becomes, well, then who gets to define when that moment of turn is? Who gets to define what violence is, right? And one of the points that came out of the book launch, I think that Professor Dr. Motia was talking about, was the difference between disruption and violence, right? That there are some protests that are disruptive, but they are not violent. So if I block a road, right, if I block traffic, is that a violent activity, right? And we can move up the scale.
Right.
If I burn a tire with no one around except the students standing around them or the protesters standing around them, is that violent, right? When do you get to the point where it is now violence? And that narrative becomes quite important because it then either gives the protest some credence or it diminishes that narrative of the protest.
Right.
Now, why people then get to that point of using physical violence, that physical altercations, is all around grievances. It's one particular theory that we could utilize. And the grievances are, I don't have something, someone else has something, and that gap between us is unjust, right? Because there's an arbitrary gap between us. And because this gap is arbitrary, there should be a mediating force that ensures that this gap between those who have and those who do not have is not as large. And when that mediating force, usually the state, sometimes a company, sometimes a community, when that mediator fails to connect these two groups continuously over time, those who are aggrieved don't pack up their bags and say, I'm no longer aggrieved next week. That anger builds, it snowballs, and it creates a positive feedback loop that gets to that transition point of, I now have exhausted all my options. I must use some sort of physical altercation. The question we must really be asking ourselves as a society, and again, I go back to, it is easy to blame the states, but by the amount of protests happening in our country every day, a question needs to be asked of society as a whole of when did we abdicate responsibility for taking care of our fellow South Africans? When did that happen? Because clearly we're not doing enough, and this is the outcome of it, and the long legacies of our problems in this country.
Fascinating. I wonder how much of this is different to what we're seeing in the world, right? Because often I think South Africans, for better or for worse, we get stuck in our own kind of silos and echo chambers and forget to view these things within the context of what the human experience is versus what's unique to South Africa.
Yeah, so once again, in the book, the very first chapter deals with that, and that chapter is by Dr. Brooks, one of the co-editors, who tries to contextualize the South African, and it was the first thing we wanted to do. How do you contextualize the South African experience with what's happening in the rest of the world? And we demarcated or delimited our arguments to the global south in particular, right? Countries that are a bit more relevant to us. It's easy to say in America, in Europe, et cetera, but we're really trying to look at countries very similar to the South African context. And what you find is that there's strong resonances across the board, strong similarities across the board, but also very important differences between protests that happen in our country and protests that happen across the global south. So it's something that we try and tackle as well.
All right, and if that doesn't move you towards at least having an interest in the book, let alone reading it, I don't know what will. Rekgotsofetse Chikane, thanks very much indeed for coming through. I'm told to hold up the book in some way or the other, but you'll do it for me. There it is. It's called Protests in South Africa, Rejection, Reassertion, and Reclamation. The "and" is my edition. And of course, very timely given all the stories we're dealing with in the country at the moment. Rekgotsofetse, one thing.
Thanks
very much for coming in.
Appreciate it.